Welcome, everybody. We have a very, very packed session and a no reserved seating policy. So please, if you're keeping a seat, it's time to either take it or move your bag and give it up to someone else. We have some older people here that really do need seats. So there's no reserved seating, I'm afraid. Okay, so just would like to say that before we begin, today we pay tribute to the founding fathers who created one of the most brilliant documents of the 20th century, the Constitution of India, which has ensured adult franchise for all. I would like to also say that please, especially in a packed session like this, it makes such a difference if you could please turn your phones to silent. And if you really do need to have a conversation, if you could take it outside for respect for our panelists, that would be fantastic. We're going to get as quickly as we can to our question and answer session so that once the discussion is over, you can ask some questions. We won't be able to get to everybody, but the authors have agreed to go to the author signing desk afterwards, so you can actually ask more questions up there. And that is just out of the exit, up the ramp, and there are 2 tables just at the top of the ramp. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the Beyond Borders on Migration and Novel session. We're very excited to have an esteemed panel here. I've been assured that Hari Kunzru is on his way, so he's going to come and join on stage as soon as he shows up. But I would like to welcome to the stage Amitava Kumar, who is our moderator today, Mr. Álvaro Enrigue, Jennifer Nansubuga Makumbi, Kaveh Akbar, and Tania James, soon to be joined by Hari Kunzru. Thank you so much for the warm, warm welcome for our panelists.
That's what you wanted.
No, I'm trying to find me. I'm just sitting there waiting for you. Hello.
Welcome. Hari Kunzru was crossing some borders, so it took him some time to get here. What I was thinking we could do is that each panelist, whom I would introduce in turn, would speak a little bit about. First of all, I'd be curious if our audience could be informed of which border they crossed to come to Jaipur. And then, maybe from one of their novels or book of poems, in case of Kaveh, talk a little bit about border crossing. And then the arc of the narrative will bend towards the novel at some point, because that's what's in the title of the piece, though if you want to avoid it, we need not do it. Cool? So I'll start with the first person mentioned on our program, Álvaro Enrigue. He's the author of 5 novels and 2 story collections. He's a recipient of the Joaquín Mortiz Prize and the New York Public Library's Cullman Fellowship. His last novel, Sudden Death, was awarded the Premio Herralde and published in 14 languages. So, Heraldo, which border did you cross to get here, borders, and how you have addressed border in your writing, or how it occupies your consciousness if you have not written about it?
Yes, does this work? Yes, it works. It works. I physically didn't cross any border to be here, right? No, it doesn't sound. Oh, now it sounds. Yes, it works. I think that the border crossing problem is mainly a bureaucratic problem. You know, the nation, the modern state nation is a 19th century invention that is exactly contemporary to the invention of modern bureaucracy. So the actual border spaces are always fictional. No, that's my impression. What you do is just like a bureaucratic thing. No, I do this thing in New York that is a workshop with the students that are undocumented. No? And they are, of course, obsessed. These are kids that are going to universities, but are going in a very fragile migratory situation. No? And they are, of course, obsessed with this problem. and the workshop has run for so long that many of them got married, and now they are citizens, no? And they always have this problem that is now what I write about. You know? And now that I became a citizen, now that my situation is not fragile anymore, what will I write about? You know? And I'm always working with them in like returning the problem of border crossing to its ultimate reality, that is just a bureaucratic problem you must never give a shit about. You know, it's really an unimportant thing. You know, was that enough? Yep. Thank you.
Hari Kunzru is the author of 5 novels, including The Impressionist and White Tears. He was a 2008 Cullman Fellow at the New York Public Library, a 2014 Guggenheim Fellow, and a 2015 Fellow of the American Academy in Berlin, and an all-round Jolly Good Fellow. In 2014, he was made Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature.
So I am a British citizen living in the United States. I've held various kinds of visa, but right now my immigration status is I have a green card that depends on my marriage to an American citizen. So my immigration status depended on demonstrating the truth of my marriage, and to do that I had to do an interview where I was asked various intimate questions about my wife, and we had to show photos that proved that we had a genuine relationship. So we had a very strange session of trying to kind of decide which vacation pictures showed us most married and in love and so on, and then there's these sort of they ask you the tough questions, you know, the address of the the children's doctor and things like that. So there's this. I'm sure people are very familiar with it from any experience of dealing with bureaucracy, is the sense that one might be in the wrong in a way that we don't fully understand. So I mean, it's a very odd thing to have to prove that you are really married to the person that you're married to. And in my work, I have thought about borders quite a lot. I mean, one novel in particular I wrote called Transmission that uses this metaphor of a kind of viral transmission of information or disease and money and other things that flow around the world across borders, to just interrogate this idea of what the border means and who gets to cross it. And I mean, I think we live in an era when there is a kind of class system that is a global class system that is associated with freedom of movement. You know, at the bottom there are people who either can't move at all or who have no choice about their movement, who are forced to move and to try and move against incredible opposition and incredible, physical opposition, to physically, cross barriers and cross borders. In the middle, there are people who can more or less move if they can fulfill certain bureaucratic requirements. And then at the very top, there are those for whom the world is a sort of ice rink. You can skate across, but there's at a certain price where everywhere begins to look the same. Every 5-star hotel room in every country in every world, and every minibar has the same bottles, and the TV has the same channels. And I wrote a novel where people are in various relations to this question of friction and to the question of ease of movement.
I like that image. Some of our best friends are ice skaters, aren't they? Kaveh Akbar is the recipient of a Pushcart Prize and a Ruth Lilly and Dorothy Sargent Fellowship. His first book is Calling a Wolf a Wolf. Akbar's poems appear in The New Yorker, Poetry, The New York Times, The Nation, and elsewhere. Kaveh?
Hi, yeah, I'm very grateful to be here. Thank you for having me. I'm a poet among novelists. I kind of feel a little bit like a pretender, so I'll get out in front of that. No, I am truly very grateful to be here. I was thinking about this question when you asked it, and I certainly have this story. I immigrated to America as a boy with my family, and have all of the sort of associate baggage one would expect with that. But I'm also really interested in the borders between, so when we moved to America, my brother, who is 7 years older than me, immediately enrolled in English school and really struggled because he couldn't speak English very well, right? And so my parents, as this sort of mechanism to help him with that, banned speaking Farsi in the household, Farsi, my first language. And consequentially, my brother and I lost our Farsi. It just atrophied, you know? And so I'm interested in these sorts of borders too, you know, the borders that we impose on ourselves, the borders that we imposed on each other, right? My parents weren't being cruel. It was an act of love that they were trying to facilitate my brother's English language acquisition, and but consequentially now in a room full of Persians, I feel like the least Persian person in that room. In a room full of Americans, I certainly don't feel American, you know? There's a Muslim ban in America right now where people from my country literally aren't allowed to come into America, you know? I have cousins whose wives can't join them, who were separated at the time that the ban went into effect. So I think a lot about these kinds of borders, right? Not just the sort of physical nation-state borders, but also these borders that we erect ourselves in our minds, the border that, you know, I have the sort of neural networks that should allow me to speak this language, right? You know, they're all in there. It was my first language, but there's some sort of border, there's some sort of neurological border literally inside my head that is blocking that from me. And because of the specifics of my situation, I'll never be allowed to go back to Iran, which means that I'll never be able to organically reopen those borders, right? I mean, I could take a class or learn it from a speaker in America, but that would be sort of learning a desiccated version of Persian that came with that person when they emigrated, you know? So it's this very sort of complicated thing that I think about.
There is a library on the US-Canadian border, and I heard a lovely radio program recently about Iranian families meeting in the library, because then you don't need a visa, right for there, and it's a short meeting. You meet for an hour or two. Children meeting their parents, etc. Next speaker is Tania James. She's the author of The Tusk That Did the Damage, Aerograms, and Atlas of Unknowns. The Tusk That Did the Damage was named the best book of 2015 by the San Francisco Chronicle, Guardian, and NPR, and was shortlisted for the International Dylan Thomas Prize and longlisted for the Financial Times Oppenheimer Award. One thing I need to quickly say before Tania speaks is that in creative writing classes, you're taught to find your voice. Unfortunately, Tania has lost a little bit of that voice, so be tolerant.
Be tolerant. It's musical, this sound coming out of my mouth, right? I'm sorry, I'm going to try. You can hear me, right? So I was, I think I might be the only second-generation immigrant, maybe Hari is as well, but my parents did the border crossing. They emigrated in 1976, and we ended up in Louisville, Kentucky. I was born in Chicago. But I think with a lot of second-generation immigrants, that story becomes part of your origin story, even though you weren't there for it. It's that home is your home. I remember growing up, you know, people in our community would say, I'm going, you know, when they would say they were going back, they say, Nati Boa, Nati Boa. I thought Nati in Malayalam means India. I thought it was another word for India or another word for Kerala. And it was years later that I learned that word means home. And so it's sort of encoded into your language. It's, you know, this idea that the ground you're standing on, to borrow a phrase from Amitava's book, the ground you're standing on is not your own. And so I think naturally then that those ideas, those themes of dislocation and nostalgia for something that you'd never really experienced or fully know fed into my first novel, Atlas of Unknowns, even if it's not really my mother's story, but these themes kind of shone through. But when I think about, I wrote that in 2003 to 2005 or later maybe, and I was looking back at the book and I felt it seems such a more innocent time when it comes to thinking about immigration in America. And I remember feeling tense and anxious about talking about immigration. How can I do this? You know, being political in fiction, how do you do that without kind of sounding like you're grandstanding. And it just seems like we're in a completely different time. And so I mean, I was just thinking about how, well, there's a lot of rage in the air in a lot of places, but immigration, border crossing, I mean, the situation we're in of tear gassing children, I mean, I feel like there's no way to be sort of tentative about how you feel anymore. So that, I think, is a big challenge for fiction writers now, to talk, how do we talk about border crossing?
Thank you. And Jennifer Nansubuga Makumbi is a fiction writer and lecturer at Manchester Metropolitan University. Her first novel, Kintu, won the Kwani Manuscript Project in 2013. Let's Tell This Story Properly won the 2014 Commonwealth Short Story Prize. Her collection of short stories will come out in 2019, followed by a second novel in 2020. She's a recipient of the Windham-Campbell Literature Prize 2018. Congratulations.
Thank you. Hello. First of all, it's wonderful to be in India, but I've never seen such a large crowd of readers. India, you do read books. And when it comes to crossing borders, I have crossed borders, me. I was born in Uganda. I grew up there, and after working for 10 years, I decided to go to Britain. And when it comes to filling in visa application forms, I'm fantastic. I'm telling you, and I'm not ashamed of telling lies. If, you know, I will tell them that I have so much money, even though I don't know where my supper is coming from. And unfortunately, though I'm married like Harry, I'm married to a British gentleman, I have hung on to my Ugandan passport, which means I have to apply for visas all the time. I must say that when I applied for the Indian visa, I was surprised I didn't pay a penny for the visa. Something about India, you know, that was wonderful.
All right.
And when it comes to writing, however, because of the experiences I've had in terms of applying for visas, because the borders are always in my face, being African. But when I started writing about my novel, I decided not to write about my experiences, because sometimes the experiences are so intense. Sometimes the anger, the pain spills on the page. And I need to step away a little bit further from my experiences to write about them objectively. So I wrote about border crossing in Uganda. Now, the borders in Uganda were colonially imposed. We Ugandans had no say in what our country looks like or the shape of it. So when you look at Uganda, we are with Sudan. But the people in southern Sudan are related to the people in northern Uganda. The people in Tanzania, some of them are related in Uganda, to people in Uganda, and it's the same in Kenya and the Congo. And when you say to people, you know, you've got to apply for a visa when they can see their cousin across the border, it becomes stupid. So in Uganda, sometimes we cross borders like ants. You know, you wake up in the morning and you say, oh, I'm going over, you know. And I thought I should write about that, but also with the hope that these borders that are imposed on us will eventually start to vanish, because they just don't make sense to us. But unlike the borders in Europe, which are actually you fill in a form, but there's no physical thing, it's just a woman behind a whatever form, you know, a glass asking you, what are you going to do? How much money do you have? Do you have land? Are you married? And you lie, and you lie, and you lie. You know, in Uganda, it's you know, you can see the no man's land, you know, and you walk across it, and you walk back in the evening, you know. And to me, that was more interesting writing about than the forms I'm filling in.
That's beautiful. Thank you.
Can I make a tiny little note on this?
Yes.
Is in the 19th century, after the Mexican-American War, in 1847, the new border between Mexico and the United States was established. It was moved to the south, and the border was the Gila River. You know? And after a year, they discovered that the Gila River changes route depending on the season of the year. So some days you were American and some days you were Mexican. And Americans really don't like that. They don't like it. They want to put a fucking wall in the middle. So, so they had to change the border to the Bravo River, that is named Rio Grande in English, in order to have it more. So that's how imaginary they are. No?
I like the fact that Jennifer mentioned that you have to fill out visa forms to cross borders. There's a story I tell in my book, Immigrant Montana, that an old man wanting to visit New Jersey from Delhi has to answer the question on the visa form that says, will you overthrow the government of the United States by force or fraud? And the old man, thinking it's an either-or question, indicates that he wants to overthrow the government by fraud. One thing I wanted to throw at you guys is the question, does a book come to mind, a book that would address the issue of borders, and maybe even the idea of novels, any book written by anyone? For example, I'm soon going to teach a book by Mohsen Hamid called Exit West, because I thought that might, for my students, living in New York, try to dramatize the idea of the borders in some ways that would be useful. And I was curious. I'm just spontaneously throwing this out at you, and I hope you'll forgive me.
You're just wanting help with your curriculum, aren't you?
Yeah. How to do with my syllabus. Hurry, let me write it out. Yeah. So, you guys just want to go down the line and maybe suggest
Don't make me go first.
Transmission?
Well, obviously I can recommend my own book. Yes, of course. You should teach my book
Can you tell the audience
to a large class.
Can you tell the audience the line about if you see someone in California?
Right. So yeah, the part of the story of transmission is about an Indian computer programmer who it's supposed to be set in 1999. It's at a time when West Coast software firms were bringing a lot of Indians over on H-1B visas, and this guy signs up with an agency in Delhi, and they promise him the world, and they promise him a guaranteed job, and he gets to Silicon Valley, and he's put in a shared house with other guys, and they're all expected to interview for positions there, and they're basically in a very precarious situation, and he has no money and he has no connections, and he has to walk. He's in a landscape that's totally dominated by the car and is made for people to drive in, and yet he has to walk. Yeah, I mean the line Amitava is mentioning is it says that anybody on foot in suburban California is either mad, poor, or jogging. And there is something. I mean, I have at times been in California without a car and have been that person walking the endless, enormous blocks over the concrete dividers between the fast food place and the gas station, and you realize that it's not a landscape that's scaled for you. There's a real diminishment and a kind of an experience of powerlessness that comes with not having access to a car, and that's in many ways that for me became a kind of very physical image of what it's like to be a migrant in a new place.
Your protagonist is limited, blocked by borders in some ways, but he unleashes a virus that traveling a different route is able to spread across the world. So often the issue of borders and writing is about degrees of mobility, I think. And so, Kaveh, do you have a recommendation, a book that you comes to mind about borders? And
Yeah, as the sort of token poet of the group, it seems only fitting that I recommend a book of poetry.
Excellent.
There's a book by the poet Javier Zamora, who is he's from El Salvador and lives in America now. He writes about his border crossing story. He is an undocumented immigrant in the States and does a lot of beautiful advocacy on that front and works with other undocumented writers. But this book is called Unaccompanied. And it's just some of the most rending lyric poetry you'll ever read, orbiting this idea of crossing a literal border, crossing this specific border, and what that was like for him as a boy who was doing it literally unaccompanied. The book, again, is called Unaccompanied by Javier Zamora, Z-A-M-O-R-A.
Jennifer?
Recommend a book that is about... before I recommend a book, can I say something about immigration? Have you noticed that immigration happens to the West? You haven't? Look here. There's immigration within Africa, okay? Societies are changing. You know, we are moving within Africa a lot. There's more immigration into Uganda than there is immigration into Britain. But all the time when you hear about immigration, oh my God, they are coming. They're on plane, they are on foot, they are on boats. We are heading to the West. It's like only the West is the only place that people are going to. But actually, there are a lot of novels being written about immigration within the Arab world, because there's a lot of immigration there. There's a lot of immigration from Sudan into Uganda, from Uganda to South Africa, from South Africa to Libya, okay? But I just wanted to put it out there that the West suffers. It suffers, it's traumatized by immigration from the rest of the world. However, the book I would suggest is a Zimbabwean book called We Need New Names.
She's here. Yeah.
It's she.
No Violet is here.
By No Violet Bulawayo. It's a book about a young girl growing up in Zimbabwe and dreaming, really dreaming about going to the US. And she cannot even pronounce the names. You know, she destroy Michigan. You know, that's Detroit. But, and then it happens. She goes to the US. Exactly the way it happens to most of us, because when I was growing up in Uganda, I thought if I go to Britain, oh my God, I'll be rich. And within 10 years, I'll go home, build a big house, buy a large car. And believe me, I haven't. I'm still in Britain, still waiting for the big house.
Álvaro.
I just want to add to your notation that yes, immigration is imaginary, it seems, if it's not to the West. But let's remember that barbarians always come from the North.
What can I say?
Yes, it's true. That one is true. That one is, no. Gloria Anzaldúa. Gloria Anzaldúa has this fantastic book name to help with the syllabus. It's really useful for college students. She has this book named, the name Borderland La Frontera, Borderland La Frontera, and it's an extraordinary essay written in Spanish and English that uses language like as a way of mining, like making holes under the general discourses. So it's very critical and incredibly smart. And it's, by now, it's kind of an historic piece because it's a book written in, I think, in the 60s or the early 70s, but it's still very useful to understand. Gloria Anzaldúa belonged to one of these towns in Texas that were Mexican and became American after the war. So it's one of these, she belongs to a family that didn't cross the border, but was crossed by a border. You know, so that point of view really changes, at least it changed my way of seeing the migratory phenomenon from Mexico to the United States, that if you consider that barbarians come from the north, it's a civilizatory movement. It is.
Tania?
I would say Kamala Shamsi's Home Fire, which came out the same year as Mohsin's book. It's about a British Pakistani family, siblings, and the opening scene is in customs. It's in customs or immigration, and it feels to me like as tense as a Tarantino kind of scene where, but like the officer and the immigrant are sort of kind of trying to navigate each other. It's so tense. I thought that was one of my favorite books of that year.
You know, I'm glad that Tania mentioned a Pakistani writer, because one of the things I've heard, I can't confirm this, but I heard that Pakistani writers like H.M. Naqvi did not get a visa and were therefore not able to come to this JLF. So we should at least note that and protest that. This might be a reductive statement, but I've always thought that novels are about time. Time passing, change, and then that axis gets reorganized if you think about borders, because then you have to pay attention to the fact that novels could be centrally about space and about how space is to be distinguished, where the border becomes the dividing line. How do you guys, since we are, the title says novels and border crossing and novels, do you think the novel is a particular, in any order? Yeah. You have divined the rest of my sentence, so please.
Oh, yeah, I'm going to make up a question and answer it. I'm going to address the question of national literature. I mean, there's a very, the way literary scholars often deal with fiction is to try and make these silos and divine sort of genealogies that exist within the borders of the nation state, and that's a very funny, quite political way of looking at things that I think is to do with the origins of literary scholarship in the project of nationalism, and is in the project of justifying the nation state as having a particular culture that comes from a particular folk, a particular people. And we live, all of us on this stage have complicated histories with nation and identity and movement and migration. And in the same way, our influences cross borders. And right now, I would say, I couldn't think of a novelist who only reads within their own national literature, and my own tastes and influences are very internationalized, as well as across languages as well. I mean, let's acknowledge translation. It would be great if we had a translator up on the stage with us, because that's the great act of literary border crossing, is the act of translation.
Someone else,
I have a student who is a deaf-blind man. He's deaf and he's blind. And he's an incredible poet. And the temporality of the poem, when we experience it, when we, the seeing population, experience it, comes to us all at once. It's like looking at a painting. We have a sense of how long this experience of looking at the poem is going to be. When he looks at a poem in Braille, right, he doesn't have that same relationship to the temporality of the poem, right? So I think about the fact that a poem is different from a novel in that when we enter into it, we have some sense of the time that we're going to be spending with it, right? Generally speaking. Just from the jump, that's what I think. I also think about right now in the year 2019, the great weapon used to stifle critical thinking in America is a raw overwhelm of meaningless language. Just meaningless language at every turn. Wherever you look, just absolutely vapid doublespeak every turn, right? And by sort of barraging us with meaningless language, it dulls our critical faculties. It makes us more passive as to what language is doing. It makes it sort of familiarizes the language in a really dangerous way. What poetry asks us to do is to slow down our metabolization of language, right? It asks us to be really, really conscious of our permeability to language. It asks us to really, really be aware of the materiality of language. The poet Rita Dove says the job of the poet is to remind people that language has integrity, right? It matters what we call things. It matters when we call human beings illegal, right? It matters when we call human beings aliens. You know, these are willful decisions. These are violent decisions that people make all the time, right? What poetry asks us to do is to slow down our metabolization of language, and therefore, any poem, it doesn't matter what its content, is infinitely potent, right? You can hand me a poem about a happy snowman or whatever, you know, and this is a potent, politically potent gesture, right? Because what you're asking me to do is to return to my awareness of the materiality of language, of the potency of language. So this is what I think about when you talk about time and poetry.
Beautiful. Jennifer.
About the novel and crossing borders. First of all, the novel is one of those things that do not respect borders at all. Yeah. The novel travels in such a way that even amazes the author. Now, I must confess that the way I look at the novel...
Just hold it closer.
The way I look at the novel sometimes is very limited to the fact that it traveled from Europe to Africa. At least this form of novel we write now. I know there was a novel that was written in Africa in the 16th century by an Egyptian, rather an Eritrean woman, but that has recently just been discovered. But the novel, the way I write it, moved from Europe and was brought to me. But, and that shows you how it crosses border. I might do things to it, but it's still that European novel that came down to Africa. But at the same time, after I published Kintu, and it was first published in Kenya, I received an email, I think it was 4 days later, I received an email from someone in Australia saying, I've just finished reading your book, and I was like, how? Under what circumstances has this novel, I mean, who gave it the visa? How did it get to Australia? You don't know how hard it is for Africans to get into Australia. But Kintu had made its way. And in a way, in that way, authors travel as well, you know. When you think about an African novel, you think about Things Fall Apart, yes? But Things Fall Apart was written in hand, and then he sent it to Britain to get typed, and it was typed, and it flew back to Nigeria, and then he sent it back to find an agent and to find, you know, a publisher, long before he traveled to Europe. But also, a lot of authors write away from home. You know, we can't move away from that. So when it comes to the novel and when it comes to the author, borders should not be imposed. It shouldn't be there, because traveling is the same as reading. Because even when you sit in your book, in your house, or lie on your bed, and you read a novel, you travel. You cross, you know, borders. So there's that thing about the novel, that thing about the author and crossing borders, that you can't separate the two.
Thank you. Álvaro.
And still the only way we have to really know the experience of the other is through reading novels. No, it's still an extraordinary tool to understand human experience at a degree that a film or a piece of art or a piece of dance will not give you. I think that it's a very problematic question because the novel is a machinery to sustain nationalities, really. You know, the golden century of the novel, that is the 19th century, is the century of the establishment of nationalities, no? Of the idea of nation as we understand it, curiously still, no? So that, I think that's why the novel survived. No one no one writes sonnets anymore. You know, people, the last epic poems were the national anthems that are in general like, there are no epic poems anymore, there are no sonnets anymore, and the novels somehow persist, even, maybe there are, I'm a total ignore. There are, let's erase that example. It's just curious that in a world in which everything is so fractionary, in which borders have become this artificial thing that is a visa filling form, etc., the novel survives, no? Yeah. And I think that that's thanks to the like original sin of the novel, that is this genius invention of Cervantes, that is a very porous machinery, no? So everything can be included in a novel, absolutely everything. So maybe that's why the novel is surviving to the, I think to the very heavy questioning, at least of the bubble of people that writes and reads in the world, that it's a minority, and not to the notion of nation state that it's so heavily criticized. You know?
Can I dive in and just to say, I mean, you're thinking about. There's the lyric utterance of the poem, which is a kind of expression of the I of the person who's speaking, of the writer, and then there is a weird kind of border crossing that you do as a writer of fiction by making characters and projecting yourself outside your experience, and I feel that's certainly a kind of border crossing that's integral to fiction in a specific form. But
I was just thinking about, you were just saying, Harry, and also about the short story form and how it can approach these questions as well. Because I think I agree that the novel is really about time and memory. And so, you know, anyone who crosses a border, you're always looking forward, or you're also looking back. There's a kind of scrim over, you know, experiences you're having, and you're layering them with the experiences you had in your other place. So I think the novel is really conducive to that perspective. But I also think short stories, because they probably kind of distill emotion in the way that a lyric poem does, like it can distill the nightmarishness of, for example, I'm thinking of a story by Cristina Enriquez, and it was in the New Yorker, and it was about a mother who had been separated from her child, a Mexican mother who'd crossed the border, or at the border, separated from her child who's in detention. And the nightmarishness could not be accomplished in any other way. It could not be accomplished in any other form. You have that kind of distance provided by fiction, but it still has that quality that is so intense and emotional. So I like the idea of that there are different ways these forms are approaching these questions.
There is, sorry, just a second. There is this moment in St. Paul, I'm sorry about my references, but I think that is in Romance, I don't remember in one or two, in which someone asks St. Paul why to keep writing. No, if the world is coming to an end, if we are here, why to keep writing? And he answers with an answer that has obsessed me for years, and I still don't totally understand. But borders what everybody's saying, that is, he answers, we write because we need to give testimony of our time. And it's a very simple sentence, but the deepness of it is tremendous. No, this piece of writing, what it does is give testimony of our pain in these artificial lines that are the borders.
Everyone has raised some excellent points. I just want them to respond to a couple of things that has been said. You know, Jennifer made a very good point that what she's saying is books travel, and authors travel too, but sometimes books travel much easier than certain authors are allowed to travel, right? I wanted to, you know, raise a point that actually, if you look for Indian novels in the libraries of universities in America, you will find them often under a code called PL. It is a particular code, and it is mentioned in a short story by A.K. Ramanujan. What it reveals to you is that under the Act PL 984, in exchange for wheat that India needed soon after independence, wheat sent from places like Kansas allowed the books to be sent in return. And so you will find in places like Berkeley, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, these books have gone in exchange for, it's a cultural exchange. I mean, in the sense that it's a material exchange. The price of wheat had to be regulated in America, comes here, and in exchange, things are sent, including books, and they all have a particular kind of smell, as if they have spent a long time under the ocean. And then you can open them and inhale the scent of your motherland, etc. Anyway, so books, novels, tied to other material exchanges, not simply cultural in the sense of coming to literary events here and reading, but tied to building of material walls, price of shipping people across, even wheat and germs, you know. One thing I wanted to ask you, also related to that, is if the last century was described as, by some folks in a novel I read, this one by Hanif Qureshi, the migrant is the everyman of the 20th century. I think in light of what some of the folks have been saying, the refugee is going to be the everyman or the every woman of our century, this century, the current century. And so novels will have to, do you think novels will have to address with even greater urgency, particularly with the challenges of climate change, water rising, people fleeing from one part to another, population and wars, whether that is going to be more and more a central topic of our discussions?
I mean, I'm very pessimistic about the future in terms of border regimes and migration, because as you point out, Amitava, I think we're only seeing the beginning of the massive migrations of people that are going to come with climate change. And you see already that the shift in the politics of rich countries where a support for an extremely aggressive border regime is growing. And certainly one of what can we do? We can do relatively little, but as artists, one thing we can do is to be very, very precise in our interrogation of the imagination of the border and of the right of people to move, the right of people to change their situation. You know, we have this. It's very. I mean, Kaveh, you brought this up. The flurry of language around the figure of the migrant is particularly obfuscatory. It's. You know, we have the slide from the word refugee with all the rights, the rights that are attached to that, to the more slippery notion of the migrant, and then the economic migrant, and there's for a long time activists in Europe, especially in Germany, have had the slogan "Kein Mensch ist illegal." No, nobody is illegal. And that word illegal came up earlier on, and that is in some ways a utopian demand. And I mean, one can see all the practical reasons why border regimes exist, and all sorts of reasons why it is useful for states to maintain them. But to maintain that imagination that no one, in their essence, is illegal. That's great. Is vitally important.
Can I ask you to hold your thoughts, because I made a miscalculation. I think we have 12, this is the time to open it, and maybe in response to audience questions, you could share whatever you were thinking at the moment if you wanted to share it. So someone has a question, maybe? Sabse paas, yeah, inko de do, and then maybe the next person will come.
Hi, this was a very good discussion. In India, documents like birth certificates, death certificates, and everything in between, educational certificates, your ration cards, voter IDs, these documents are being weaponized by the state to create these categories of legal, illegal, to make certain categories of people legible, others illegible. So these people, especially with reference to the Citizenship Amendment Bill that just got passed in the Lok Sabha and is waiting for the Rajya Sabha for the next month. So this government right now is trying to do this on the basis of religion, which is very harmful for a country where secularism is one of the basic features of the constitution. These people from the border across Bangladesh, they have come out of economic necessity. They have been now portrayed as demons who are trying to encroach upon the lands, resources of the sons of the soil. I want to know from your personal experience, anyone who would like to address the question, or from the research for your work, what are some of the creative attempts by communities and people to bend these borders that the state so, tries to maintain?
I'm ill-equipped to answer her question because in Uganda, as I explained, because the people who come from Sudan speak the same language that we do in Uganda. They are not labeled. You cannot say, oh, you're not Ugandan. They will speak the same language. It becomes a bit difficult, and we are not so good at keeping records. You know, when it comes to birthdays, they shift, depending on what you want. So, if they ask for a birth certificate, you just turn around and go and tell your cousin, you know what, I need a birth certificate. Who will talk to somebody and a birth certificate will appear. Because of that, this is why I'm saying I'm ill-equipped to answer your question, because Uganda is so different from India.
Sure. Anyone else want to try?
There is this example, sorry, really fast. This example that is the caravans that are arriving from Central America to the United States border through Mexico. No? The trip for individuals was tremendously dangerous because there are drug lords, there is the army, there is the migration officers of Mexico, of the United States, and the people is crossing, I don't know, 4 or 5 borders in order to get to the United States. No? So there is this like amazing self-organizing system in which the people that wants to leave Honduras or Nicaragua or whatever country will get together and walk together to Mexico. No? And doing that, they brought media attention. And these people has been, Mexico has been always particularly brutal to Central American migrants, but I mean brutal, shamelessly brutal. And these kind of caravans have produced the opposed reaction in the people. Now the people in Mexico is protecting these migrants that are not by themselves. Oh, yeah. And the cities are forced to answer to the people because it's a democracy. So they are giving, not houses, but spaces to spend the night and food and everything to the people. But this is all something that has happened absolutely out of the imagination of the state. It's people getting together, doing things, and people protecting that people so they can do things. So I think that it always has to be done that way, no? Outside of the margins of the bureaucratic imagination that is so limited.
Oh, yeah.
You know, Alvaro's watch has not crossed the border. It is showing another time, and that confused me. So your questions have to be short. So there's someone in that line? Oh, this gentleman, yeah.
I want to explore the humanity of the security officers or the lens of the drone. What type of culture stereotyping or hierarchical relationship that builds? And I was reading this paper by Konopinski, an Israel-Palestine border, where she says the anticipation of terror, the anticipation of violence. So how novels and how literature explore that anticipation and their cultural stereotyping of the other?
Americans.
What was the question?
I mean, we could certainly say something about the virtualization of the border and the fact that the border is I mean, this absurd wall which dominates American politics at the moment. In reality, the border regime has now kind of metastasized through society. You can be physically inside and yet outside because you don't have papers, or there are other ways that that your status kind of determines who you are. So you're pointing to someone else. No.
Raise your hand.
I've lost my thread. Someone else could. Someone else could. Yeah.
That's good. Yeah.
Ganesh, you had your question, and then this lady here.
Hi all, that was a fantastic session. Two of the groups that I think I seem to hear questioning the imaginary or the absurdity of borders most are writers like yourself and climate change scientists. I wondered to what extent you've ever thought about or feel the imperative to bend your fiction or your poetry to somehow grapple with that reality, with that and the sort of impending apocalypse of that. But let me know.
So it's a question about environmental literature. Literature tied to the apocalyptic or the catastrophic possibilities that loom large on our planet?
I mean, I feel it's weird how there was a moment where apocalyptic fiction was confusing whether it's science fiction or it's reality, and I think that line is getting more and more blurred. But I guess I too feel like climate change is going to require a reckoning. My attention has been sort of, all my attention is on the southern border crossing at the moment, because I feel that this is a extremely shameful moment. I can't remember a moment in my life where I've seen images like those, and not that this country hasn't committed those kinds of cruelties, but it almost seems like not the entire nation, but a good part of it was repulsed by itself. And so I feel like that I'm not the one to write about it. It's not my place, but I know that there are people who will, or who are equipped to do it. But those are the people I feel like who are actually there or in a position to kind of, because it's real. You know, I do think it requires a level of knowledge of place and language, but I've learned that just because something feels important to me, like a very important issue, I may not be prepared or equipped to write about it. But that might be different for all of you.
I never bend my stories to suit a subject, because then the reader can spot it a mile away. You know, I prefer all my subjects to arise organically, you know. But I am aware of climate change, and I'm really uncomfortable with the apocalyptic stories that have come up, and I intend to write about it. Of course, I'll center Africa at the center of it, and Africa is going to save the world from climate catastrophe. But like you, I feel I'm not yet equipped. I haven't acquired the kind of knowledge I need to tell that kind of story. And it's too close at the moment with a lot of anger and, you know, especially with what is going on in America. But I have kept on putting it off because I'm not yet ready to handle it.
So we just have 2 minutes, so I hope you'll ask a question that can be answered in a yes or a no from these people.
Yeah. No, I'm sorry. I don't think I'll be able to oblige. I was just wondering, as someone who has traveled around the world, and I have at times felt more at home with the foreigner than with some of my fellow Indians. And I was just wondering that whether being a migrant author, is that not too facile a description, in the sense that, for example, you're a poet and you write about love. Would you write differently just because you've come from Persia than, you know, or somebody else? Is that not, some themes can be specific and you will be more sensitive, for example, when you write about homecoming or whatever. But if you were writing about a universal theme, would you write differently just because you're a migrant? Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes or no?
Yeah, let me answer quickly with a quick anecdote. The Argentinian writer Jorge Luis Borges was obsessed with infinity, and he wrote a lot about infinity, Library of Babel. You know, he was obsessed with this idea of infinity. And late in his life, he got to go to the Sahara Desert, which he was obsessed with because, you know, what better way for the human mind to approximate infinity than by, you know, the trillions of grains of sand in the Sahara, right? So he goes to the Sahara Desert, and he reaches down and he picks up a handful of sand and he lets it run through his fingers, and he says, "I am modifying the Sahara." You know, and that was his big revelation. Just, I am modifying the Sahara. When you ask this, I think about that story all the time, and I think about how every experience I have, every interaction that I have, indelibly inflects my psychic Sahara. You know, every text that I read, every cereal box that I read, every novel I read. Sometimes, you know, when I read Beloved, that was like, you know, a bunch of moving trucks came in and terraformed a new archipelago. That was a huge, huge thing. You know, when I read when I read like a comic strip or something like that, that might just be moving a grain of sand from here to here. But of course, you know, that my first language had a different sort of linguistic architecture will indelibly inflect the way that I shape words, even if I'm writing about universal themes like love and fear of death and, you know, these sorts of things.
This, in my biased view, this has been the most intelligent panel discussion I have myself been at. So please thank our speakers.
Thank you so, so much to our wonderful panel. What a fascinating session. We'd love to present you with a scarf to say thank you for your time and your insights. Another round of applause for a fantastic, fantastic panel. Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. So please, please take any rubbish with you. And we're going to be having our next session here in 10 minutes.